LBC News.
24 minutes after 3. Let's turn our attention to America. Donald Trump's defense lawyers, they are poised to present evidence in the US Senate denying charges he incited insurrection in the Capitol riots of the 6th of January. The team's indicated it may take up only 4 of its 16 hours and so move the impeachment trial to a speedy conclusion. Democrats have spent 2 days putting forward their case. Let's gauge a view now live on LBC News with Trevor McCrisken, Associate Professor of American Politics and International Studies at Warwick University. Good afternoon to you, Trevor.
Good afternoon, Jim.
Let's take us back then to what we've been hearing so far. I mean, the Democrats using, a lot of video evidence, in their view, showing that Mr. Trump did indeed, incite violence. Is that a fair summation of what we've seen so far?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a very impassioned prosecution, hasn't it, from the House Impeachment Managers? And as you say, much of what the focus has been on is using some new video evidence. So video evidence based on some of the security cameras within the Capitol building, showing the situation unfolding on the 6th of January. And also a sort of a really quite shocking and striking montage that went on for about 13 minutes of all sorts of bits of video from outside and inside the Capitol building, some of it from social media, some of it from people that were trying to defend the Capitol building against the rioters. And of course, also interspersing with that, the speech that Donald Trump gave on the Mall in Washington on that day, which is being used as one of the major pieces of evidence against him, suggesting that it was his words, his language on that day in particular, that incited the crowd to march on the Capitol and to fight to overturn the election. And so that's been the sort of main focal point of what the House Impeachment Managers have been doing, just to really demonstrate the high levels of violence that did happen on that day, what some of the kind of shared language was between those rioters and the president himself. You could hear them chanting things and repeating some of the things that Trump himself had been saying. And also, I think, to demonstrate the close proximity of those rioters to some of the members of Congress, some of the senators and the staff, because again they showed really dramatically how police officers on Capitol Hill were just about managing to get some of those members of Congress out of the way of the incoming rioters, sometimes with just a couple of minutes or even seconds between the sort of time that they sort of reached a particular part of the Capitol building. So it's been, I think, a very sort of visually impactful and really quite emotional sort of prosecution that's been brought over the last couple of days.
Well, so the question next is, what exactly will the defence team argue?
Well, their position from the beginning here is that, firstly, they don't believe this process should be taking place because the president is no longer the president. President Trump is now a private citizen. And so they've tried to argue that this is actually unconstitutional and that there's no constitutional grounds to to hold an impeachment trial when an individual has already left office. They're on dodgy ground there because there is actually precedent for this, not for a president, but for another member of an administration back in the 19th century who did have to face an impeachment trial after leaving office. So they've had that sort of part of their defense rejected, but it does seem that they're going to return to that again this afternoon when they start to make their arguments. But their main emphasis really hinges on the idea that Trump didn't directly incite the violence. They're going to argue under the First Amendment of the Constitution, which protects free speech, that the things that Donald Trump has been saying, a lot of the false claims that he's been making, are his right to make as an American, because the First Amendment protects people to say what they think. And they're going to argue that there's no direct correlation between what Donald Trump has been saying on January 6th itself and in the build up to that over several months around his claims about the election. They're going to argue that isn't what caused the riot, that these individuals that were rioting on Capitol Hill were doing so of their own volition, not because they've been told to do so by the president. So that's the sort of argument that they're going to try and make to defend him. And again, I think come back to this question as to whether he can still be sort of held accountable through this particular process now that he's no longer in that position of being president of the United States.
So once we will have heard from both sides of the argument, what happens next after that?
Well, it will eventually go to a vote. I think before then, there's an opportunity for the senators on both the Republican and the Democratic side to ask questions of both the House Impeachment Managers and the defense team. So we'll probably see that happening maybe later today or into tomorrow. If the defense team doesn't take the full amount of time that they've been given to present their case, then it's possible that vote will happen earlier. And in order to convict the President Trump, former President Trump, then it would need to be a 2/3 majority of all senators to vote in favor of conviction. The problem for the prosecution team is that the Democratic Party only has 50 members of the Senate, and the Republicans have 50 members of the Senate as well at the moment. And so they need 17 of those Republicans to come across and vote with the Democrats in order to convict. All the evidence so far suggests that they won't get that many Republicans siding with them, and therefore there'll be an acquittal for the second time of being impeached. Trump will be acquitted in a Senate trial, and that would mean then that obviously the sort of moves that the Democrats would like to see to bar him from office in the future are unlikely to take place.
So, if that happens, Donald Trump would be free to run in 2024?
Most likely, yes. Most likely he would be. And so, I mean, that does raise questions then about what was the point of all of this if they knew from the beginning it was unlikely that they were going to get a conviction. But I think what the Democratic Party, and in fact some within the Republican Party as well, who think that he really does need to be held to account, and I think they fear for the future of their party if the sorts of ideas that Donald Trump sort of advocated continue to be influential within the party. I think they're interested in trying to air as many of these arguments as they can, partly for history, I suppose, partly for the sort of legacy that the events of the last few weeks will sort of have for American politics going forwards. But I think they're trying to convince the general public that, you know, Donald Trump is perhaps not the character that some people think he is. He's got a lot of support in the country, but maybe those individuals need to think twice about whether they would vote for him again if he did run in 4 years' time. But of course, he's also talking about potentially starting a new party of his own. So even if the Republican Party ended up not choosing him as their presidential candidate, he might have his own party that would run and enable him to run as the presidential candidate in 4 years' time. And that could obviously have really damaging effects on the Republican Party's chances of defeating Joe Biden, assuming that he's the candidate again in 4 years' time for the Democrats. So there's an awful lot of politics involved in this. It's a much more political rather than legal process that's going on at the moment. But it does look as though, because of the way that the partisan politics is working in Washington at the moment, that he's most likely, Donald Trump, going to be acquitted, and therefore most likely will be free to run for president again in 4 years' time.
We'll keep a close watch on developments as that defence begins in a couple of hours from now. Thank you very much, Trevor McCrisken, Associate Professor of American Politics and International Studies at Warwick University.
This is LBC News.